Press the bell icon on YouTube and don't miss another update.
I'm with Shyam Saran, former Foreign Secretary and one of India's best-known political analysts. Sir, welcome to ThePrint. My first question to you is about Prime Minister Narendra Modi's foreign policy achievements. It's only about 6 or 7 months left for this tenure to end. How do you look at what he's done?
There are three features which mark Prime Minister Modi's approach to foreign policy, which is perhaps a little different from what we have seen before. One is that he obviously places a great deal of emphasis on what he calls leader-to-leader diplomacy. That is a sense that a lot of issues that are between India and important
like what, for example?
Well, with regard to, for example, with the United States, if you recall, with Obama, he was able to overcome the negative legacy on the nuclear issue by working out some kind of a deal on insurance pool for the liability issues. The fact that he believes that by having this kind of personal engagement, this also has a positive impact on the bilateral relationship. Right. Maybe not with respect to each and every specific issue, but creating a much more positive atmosphere, a much more, I think, constructive.
So we saw that with the swearing in.
So I think he certainly believes that it is very important to establish that kind of a personal engagement with foreign leaders. Sometimes it works well, sometimes maybe it is not as effective, but this is certainly one of the...
Give me an example of that. Give me an exple of when it has worked well. For example?
Well, it has, obviously with Obama, it seemed to have worked quite well. The jury is still out. We still have to see how the relationship works out. But, for example, we have been able to overcome the problem which could have emerged on, say, the Iran oil purchase issue.
So we have got a waiver from the Americans.
So now it's very difficult to say how much can it be ascribed to his personal relationship with Trump or just the importance of the relationship between the two countries. But I think what I'm trying to convey is what are the ways in which maybe he looks different from previous leaders in terms of foreign policy.
But the fact that Trump did not accept India's invite to the Republic Day celebration.
Well, I don't think, number one, it was, I don't know how it happened. Normally, these things are not made public until an acceptance has.
So you were surprised that...
Yes, I was surprised that even before, we knew whether he had accepted the invitation or not, the information was already out.
So why were you surprised?
Because it doesn't, in a diplomatic, sort of tradition, these things are not revealed before there is an acceptance. You keep this quiet because for some reason, if the other side is not able to accept, then there should not be any embarrassment to you or even to the other side.
So was there an embarrassment to India in this particular case?
I should think so, because once it was out that he was being invited, and then we heard later on that he was not able to accept the invitation. Optically it did not look so nice. So, but as I said, it was a surprise in the sense that normally we would not have invitations, especially at the summit level, already made public before, in fact, we know whether it is going to be accepted or not.
So in this particular case, the Prime Minister's personal diplomacy that you're talking about, he likes this rapport that he wants to establish.
I can't say that this should be ascribed to the Prime Minister himself. I don't know why it was, reported before the acceptance had been made. I don't think Prime Minister himself may have had anything to do with it. Right. Perhaps there was a leak somewhere in the system. But I won't ascribe it to,
Sure. But it was an embarrassment nonetheless.
Yes, it was. I think it was an embarrassment.
But this personal diplomacy that you talked about is very interesting, because as soon as Prime Minister Modi came to power in May 2014, at his swearing in, he called all the leaders of South Asia, including the Pakistan Prime Minister, then Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. Now, how did that happen? Now that was really unusual, wasn't it?
No, but it was unusual, but I think it was, at that particular point of time, it was a very good move on his part, because after all, we have been saying this for several years now that, there has to be the first priority attached to the relationship that we have with our neighbors.
Okay.
That you can't really run a optimal foreign policy unless you get your neighborhood right. If that is the case, and I think he certainly believed that to be the case, I think it was a very sound policy and an imaginative policy move on his part to invite all the heads of state and government from neighboring countries to his swearing, because it created a very positive ambience.
Right. And we heard that Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, at the time he was Prime Minister, he sort of overcame his own negative his own establishment.
Well, we don't know whether the Pakistani army was in favor of his coming or not, but the fact that he took that risk is certainly something which we should have welcomed. And as you saw, I mean, although relations soured after some time, as you saw, at least in the initial phase, there were some encouraging signs in terms of how India, Pakistan would take the relationship forward.
So when you say the relationship soured, what happened?
Well, the relationship soured for exactly the same reason that the relationship has soured in the past, which is every time that there is a move made, perhaps with the effort of both sides to take the relationship into a different and more positive track, you then have some cross-border, terrorist incident which then, sours the whole atmosphere. And the sense, therefore, in India is that even when you are dealing with a civilian prime minister on the other side, who may genuinely wish to improve relations with India, there are very, very powerful elements, perhaps in the Pakistani army, perhaps in the ISI, who do not wish to see this change in the relationship, because it seems to affect their own, very, very real vested interests.
So explain what that means, because we saw with Imran Khan when he became Prime Minister a few months ago, the Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, did reach out to Imran Khan, wrote him a letter congratulating him, saying we must have engagement. And then we have the External Affairs Minister, Sushma Swaraj, first, and her office, the Foreign Office, announcing a meeting with her counterpart and then cancelling within 24 hours.
Well, don't forget that for any government, to be seen as reaching out to Pakistan, whereas the ground situation on the LOC or, for example, in Kashmir is really moving in a very negative direction, is a very difficult call to make. So I think, especially for this government, which has tried to suggest that it is much more tough in terms of dealing with, these challenges.
Inside Kashmir? Inside Jammu
Inside Kashmir and with respect to Pakistan. I think it is sometimes difficult to manage this balance between the compulsions of what I think would be a foreign policy which would dictate that even if you have doubts about Imran Khan, test him out. Why not engage with a new government, because after all it is a new government, and see where it takes you. Maybe you will again be disappointed, but I see no reason why we should not take a few steps to at least see whether or not there still is some room available.
So what did that show? So what did that show to you, sir? The fact that you confirmed a meeting and then cancelled within 24 hours. What did that show?
Well, I mean, it was cancelled because of certain incidents which had taken.
No, those incidents had taken place before this time.
Okay, maybe the full import of what those incidents were was not immediately apparent to the government, and maybe in the meantime, maybe opposition may have built up. With it.
Not apparent to the government. I mean, that sounds a bit odd. You have the whole government.
Well, we have seen that the whole government does not necessarily work, as if everything is coherent and tandem. So, I think these things have happened in the past, and I imagine that they will continue to happen in the future. But what I'm trying to point out is that with respect to Pakistan, there is whether we like it or not, there is an important domestic dimension.
But you were
And it's
surprised.
unfortunate, because I think that foreign policy should not necessarily be mixed up with domestic issues, because that constrains your ability to, pursue a objective kind of a foreign policy.
But you were surprised when the meeting was cancelled within 24 hours?
No, I can't say I was surprised, because I have seen this kind of thing happening so many times in the past. So
It's such a high-profile meeting. You first you engage, then you confirm, then you.
What is so high profile about it? I mean, this is, if you look at the pattern of India-Pakistan relations, you will find that this is certainly nothing very unusual.
Okay, so not an embarrassment. This was, you don't think?
Not really an embarrassment, but as I said, I would have. I'm not aware of all the compulsions which are at work, but I would have said that once there is a new government in Pakistan and the new Prime Minister there is also making some positive noises, why not try and engage and see where it can take you? I mean, that does not negatively affect you in any way. So I do see that maybe there was a opening which maybe we should have taken advantage of, because it has always been my view that it is very important to keep engaged with Pakistan, precisely because our relations are fraught, precisely because these relations have a huge baggage of history. The fact that there is constituencies on both sides who do not wish to see the relationship improve. I think it is important for India's own sake, if we really want to have a good neighborhood policy, you need to at least engage Pakistan to make certain that the relationship with Pakistan does not then become a constraint on you in following other aspects of your foreign.
But what does that mean? Because Prime Minister Modi has said consistently that we will not talk to Pakistan until cross-border terrorism comes to an end. And the previous prime ministers have also said that.
Well, I mean, we have stated that in the past, but that has also not prevented us, when an opportunity has arisen, to reach out or to respond to Pakistan. So what I'm trying to say is that precisely at times when the relationship is tense and perhaps going in a more negative direction, engagement with Pakistan is something that must not be interrupted.
So you think India should engage with Pakistan even today?
I have always been of the view that we should be, talking to Pakistan. There should be a dialogue with Pakistan, precisely for the reasons that these relations are so negative.
So you think India should talk to Pakistan on all these issues, both Jammu and Kashmir, terrorism and the others? And there should be a comprehensive dialogue, or whatever kind of dialogue.
Well, whatever label you want to put with it, or what is the nature of the engagement, those are matters of detail. Right. But as I said, communication between the two sides.
But it seems that this government, in fact, wants to isolate Pakistan.
Well, Pakistan wishes to isolate India too. I mean, so what is so new about it? But I think on the issue of, for example, terrorism, this is not only an India-Pakistan issue. Right. By the way, I mean, it is not specific only to India. After all, it is also an issue with respect to Afghanistan. Even with respect to terrorism in Western countries, sometimes you find that the roots are in Pakistan. So to make it out to be an India-Pakistan issue is not, to my mind, correct, because it is an international issue, a regional issue. Right. Secondly, I think it also needs to be appreciated that if you take, say, the Pakistani nuclear issue, this is not only a issue with India. It is international. It has international ramifications. The buildup of nuclear weapons that is taking place, the threat to deploy theater nuclear weapons, which may bring down the threshold of nuclear use. All these are issues not specific to India, Pakistan. So that is one element. The second element is, of course, what we do with respect to the issues between the two countries, and cross-border terrorism certainly has to be on the top of the bilateral agenda.
So explain to me the connection between Pakistan and China. And to come back to Prime Minister Modi's personal diplomacy, he's also made an outreach to China. He went to Wuhan, where there was this big summit with President Xi Jinping. So explain this triangle.
Well, the fact that the Wuhan informal summit took place, the fact that the two leaders spent several hours in one-to-one meetings, certainly demonstrates that the Chinese leadership attaches a great importance to relationship with India. I don't think that they would have been, as I said before, in another context, that they can't be talking about the weather for 4 hours or 5 hours.
So besides the weather, what do you think they talked
about? Well, I think they would have talked about, how do India and China relate to one another in a global situation which is changing so fast, being transformed so fast. That many of the assumptions on which we have based our relations, not only with each other, but with other countries as well, those assumptions are actually being eroded day by day. Also, a issue of reassurance. That if China has a sense that there is some kind of a ganging up taking place against China, to be able to convey to China that is not the policy
so
of
India.
India.
Is not
but at the same
China.
time, also for China to recognize that there are certain important, sensitive and core interests on our side where we expect the Chinese side.
Like what? Like what kind of core interests?
Well, I mean, if you look at what is happening in the neighborhood or Pakistan itself, that we do see that in terms of the relationship with Pakistan, it is now gone to a stage where Pakistan obviously plays a very important role in China's overall regional and global diplomacy. That has brought about a change in terms of the balance in the relationship between China and India itself. So how China is looking at its own role in this changing world order is also something that we need to be aware of. And it is only through these conversations that you can get a sense of how China is looking at these changes. Like for example, what's happening with Trump now. There has been a very major change in China's view of, can Trump be managed? Can the trade war actually be handled successfully by China? From then to now, there is a big change.
So before I bring you to Trump, I'd like to ask you about, so you think Prime Minister Modi would have said to Xi Jinping that we expect China to recognize India's sensitivities in the neighborhood?
Well, I don't know what
Obviously
they talked about, but I would imagine, yes, I mean, I would imagine that, a productive dialogue between the two countries would have to address that. What are our red lines? What are our core interests? Where we expect that if China wishes to have a positive relationship with India, those are the criteria on which we would judge whether or not China is sensitive to.
So what are India's red lines in the neighborhood?
Well, I mean, obviously, if you are looking at the subcontinent, anything which happens in our neighborhood, it directly impacts on India's.
But we see in Sri Lanka, for example, China is building a port in Hambantota in the south of Sri Lanka. Pakistan, you've already talked about. In Nepal, they have a very close relationship, similarly with Bangladesh. So what are these red lines? It doesn't seem to be around any.
So I think it is not necessary that China would buy into everything that you say would determine what our attitude towards China would be. But I think it is important for China to know that if this is the threshold you're going to cross, then you should not be surprised if there is a reaction from India. That this is something which cannot be, we cannot turn our eyes away from. And if there is a countervailing response from India, don't be surprised. Also at the same time, I would also like to mention that there are global issues where actually India and China have certain common interests.
Right.
Whether it is with respect to, say, the WTO, whether it is with respect to how the climate change challenge is handled, what do we do with new domains like cybersecurity, or what happens to space-based assets. There are important reasons why India
countries should
and
talk to
China,
each other.
yes.
But tell me about the Dalai Lama. He's been in India since 1959. He's 83 years old. Then we have the question of the Karmapa Lama, who's now got a foreign passport. How does India deal with these very venerable Tibetan leaders, especially when there is China who wants you to give them up?
Well, I think certainly I would hope that there is no issue of giving up as far as His Holiness the Dalai Lama is concerned. I think not only has he been a very important and figure of great respect and reverence in India, but I think we should also recognize that he has contributed a great deal to India through his spiritual activities.
Do you think Prime Minister Modi would have spoken to, would this subject have come up in the Wuhan summit?
I have no idea. But I would say this, that number one, it is in India's interest that there should be some kind of reconciliation between His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Chinese authorities, because this is only to the advantage of China. For China to think that once His Holiness is no longer alive, that somehow the Tibetan issue will automatically get resolved, I think that is not true.
What kind of reconciliation?
Well, a reconciliation which is a very reasonable, expectation which His Holiness himself has put forward. Which that essentially, it has already been recognized that Tibet's place in the Chinese Republic is not an issue anymore. What is at issue is how the Tibetans are treated in terms of the preservation of their cultural heritage, their language, their right to worship as they wish to, follow their religion, and also which would allow His Holiness to, in fact, return to China, to Tibet.
You think India you think His Holiness the Dalai Lama should return to Tibet, to China?
He wants to. He wishes to. I mean, that's he has made that quite plain, that he would like to have.
And you think there should be an honourable settlement between?
I think it is in China's interest that they should reach out to him. And by the way, there have been indications in the past that there has been that reaching out, although it has not finally led to something positive. But that reaching out has taken place. So
what can India do?
I don't think there is much that India can do, except to perhaps in the conversations that we have with China, we do put across this view, because we have a large Tibetan community in India, a large number of young Tibetans who are there. The Dalai Lama exercises a very restraining influence on what could be very radical militant elements within the Tibetan community. And, in today's world, where you have, communications on both sides of the border can flow quite easily, there could be challenges in the future with respect to the Tibetan community here and the Tibetans on the other side, which could complicate relations between India and China. So it is in their interest.
Mr. Saran, you're a China hand, you've served in China, you know the Chinese well, you speak Chinese. When you talk to them about the Dalai Lama, what do they say?
Well, one is a formal position, which is to say that, he is still engaged in spiritist activities, and that he is still engaged in pro-independence activities. But I think in informal conversations, there are Chinese who do acknowledge that perhaps it would be worthwhile to try and reach out to His Holiness. Don't forget that in the past there have been envoys of His Holiness who have engaged the Chinese side in a dialogue. Exactly, unfortunately.
So let me ask you about the Karmapa Lama. He came to India as a 14-year-old. The Indian establishment, the intelligence agencies believe he's a Chinese spy. He's now left the country and now has a foreign passport. Do you think this is a failure of Indian diplomacy?
Well, I am not very sure how strong the belief was that he's a spy for the
But as foreign,
Chinese.
you were foreign secretary when you were
When I was foreign secretary, I also did meet the Karmapa, and I did believe that he should be not subject to the kind of restrictions that he had been, and also the Dalai Lama himself had taken him under his wings, and for example, arranged for his education.
So why is this a failure of Indian diplomacy that he had to leave India and get a foreign passport?
Well, I mean, it is his choice. Whether he wishes to live in India and whether he wishes to live abroad. I don't think we should determine whether he should be living in India or whether he should be living abroad. Wherever he feels comfortable, wherever he feels that he can practice what he wishes to, it is his decision. So if he has taken a decision to acquire, as you say, a foreign passport and wishes to stay abroad, I see no reason why that should be a matter of such great concern to us.
So my last question to you on this issue is about the Prime Minister and the Dalai Lama. He has never met him publicly. Why is that? And do you think he should?
Well, there has been, since the Dalai Lama came to India, the meetings between the Dalai Lama and the Prime Minister or the President was openly acknowledged. I don't think there was any issue about...
But why has Prime Minister Modi not met the Dalai Lama publicly?
That is, you must ask him. I have no idea why he has not met him. But as I said, there has not been a sort of a practice of the Dalai Lama not being received by an incoming Prime Minister or
so this is unusual in that case?
Well, I presume that even though a public meeting has not taken place, perhaps a private meting may have taken place.
So let me just then take you to Nepal and ask you about Nepal. India and Nepal have had a very rocky relationship these last few years during the Modi government. What do you make of that? Well,
again with Nepal, the initial phase of diplomacy towards Nepal seemed to have been very successful. Don't forget that when Prime Minister Modi made his first visit to Nepal and he spoke before the National Assembly there was a lot of positive response to him. So at least in the initial stages, we seem to have done all the right things.
Then what happened when you had the blockade? And again,
well, there were 2 or 3 factors. I think India is always a factor in domestic politics in Nepal. Whether you like it or not, it gets mixed up in their domestic politics. And I think projecting India as somehow a threat to Nepal's sovereignty and independence, this has been an old kind of ploy, not only by the current ruling party, but by other parties as well. So that does not surprise me so much. I think in the last few years, 2 or 3 things have happened. One is that quite obviously the penetration by China into Nepal has been more significant than perhaps it has been in the...
Are you worried about that?
Of course one will be worried about that.
Don't
forget that Mr. Nehru said that as far as our security perimeter is concerned, it is the Himalayas. So any strong foreign presence which may be entrenched in our immediate neighborhood ought to be a matter of great concern to India, whether it is in Nepal or whether it is in Sri Lanka or whether it is in Maldives. So the fact that not only in Nepal but across the board in our neighborhood, there is a greater Chinese activism, firstly in economic terms, but we also see, for example, in Nepal, we have seen over the last few years that there has been a Chinese activism even in domestic politics,
right,
in terms of how they are relating to particular leaders or how they are relating to particular political parties. So this has been a matter of...
So trying to shape trying to shape Nepali domestic politics.
Yes. Yes. The fact is that the Chinese are able to deploy far larger resources in terms of doing projects, in terms of increasing their involvement in these countries, than unfortunately we are able to do. I mean, we simply do not have the same kind of capabilities today as the Chinese have. So we have to recognize that. We have to then work out, if there is this asymmetry, then how do we try to overcome that? What are the other assets which we have, which we can use in terms of developing our relationship with our neighbors? The fact that we are immediate neighbors, the fact that if we choose, we could actually become the engine of growth for the entire neighborhood.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shyam Saran, for speaking to The Print.